Good to see everybody this morning. Turn to Genesis chapter 10. I was asked if we're going to go over the questions, and I'll readily admit I don't know how Russ's mind works, so I don't know that, but we will go over them a little bit. I'm going to do a little bit of different this morning. I'm going to kind of do an overview of the two chapters real quickly, and then we will get into the questions, and hopefully we can answer them the way Russ intended for their answers to be. We'll just have to wait and see. Some of them are just opinions anyway, or speculation. So we'll be able to get through those in just a second. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. David, would you word that prayer for us? Okay, chapter 10. We have there in chapter 10, we have the point of interest in this chapter is that it gives prophetically as well as historically the names of the principal nations that came from Noah, from his three sons. It begins with Japheth's family, probably because he was the eldest. You can see from chapter 10, verse 5, that the Japheth was his posterity were ultimately the Gentile nation. And then in verses 6 through 20, we have the genealogy of Ham. There's more detail in that, and we'll talk about that shortly. He has a lot of emphasis on Nimrod. Nimrod is called a mighty man, a man of renown. It appears that he had great ambition. It appears that he aspired above all his neighbors. He was progressive in his thoughts and his actions. We'll see later on that he built several cities. We see that beginning in verse 9, 10, 11, and 12. He built several cities that would affect the Jewish nation down in their history later on. It seems he had the same spirit as those before the flood, the mighty men, the giants that we talked about a week or so ago, the men of renown. Again, several cities, verses 10 through 12. And those cities that he built would ultimately have an effect on the nation of Israel. And that's the idea on these first 11 chapters, is how did it affect Israel? How did Israel come out of all this? Where did it come from? What effect did these first 11 chapters and the details found within these chapters have to do with the nation of Israel? It appears that he was a great hunter, a great ruler. Babel was the beginning of his kingdom. In fact, it's the first kingdom mentioned in the Bible. He was a great builder, we can see, as the cities that he built. And then verses 15 through 20, we have an account of the posterity of Canaan. The families that descended from him, the lands that they took over and inhabited. And we know that Canaan was under a curse. Do you remember why? Let me ask you a question. He saw his father naked. That's the reason there was a curse. He saw his father naked. Is that why he was cursed? Because he saw him? Because he didn't do anything about it, right? Like his brothers did. And you go back to Genesis chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 when the original sin, and the first thing that was noticed by Adam and Eve was their nakedness. And so it was, ingrained in human beings that you were not supposed to be naked, and God made them clothing out of the plants. And so we understand from that he was not to leave his father exposed like that. He was to cover him up in some way, but instead he went and told his brothers about it. So there's a curse, and that curse would be that he would be a servant of servants to Shem, and also to Japheth, and the posterity of Shem and Japheth. Canaan appears when we look at Canaan, the land of Canaan. That was the land of milk and honey that was promised to the Israelites later on in the Bible story. So it appears that Canaan, even though he was cursed, he had the better land. Better than Shem and better than Japheth possibly. But yet Shem had the better lot. He had the blessing of God that came through his posterity. And then verses 21 through 31, we have the genealogy of Shem. He was the father of all the children of Eber. According to Josephus, Eber came to be the origin of the word Hebrews, which is later that word is used to identify the children of Israel. Through Eber, then we have coming Abraham, chapter 11, verses 16, and the verses that follow are in chapter 11. He was, it appears, Noah's second born. We notice that the youngest was Ham. He came in and left his father uncovered. The oldest was Japheth, so it appears that Shem was the second born of Noah. He's referred to as the brother of Japheth and not the brother of Ham. Why? You know, Russ said in the beginning we'll have a lot of questions that are going to come up that we're not going to be able to answer, and this is speculation. This is purely speculation on my part. But think about that a minute. Who were the descendants of Japheth? What the primary Gentiles, right? Verse 5, chapter 10. Okay, and Shem was the descendants of Israel. How did Israel and the Gentiles mesh later on in the Bible story? Thousands of years later, under the new covenant. So maybe that's the reason he's called the brother of Japheth and not the brother of Ham, because Japheth is the descendants are from Gentiles, Shem, the descendants are from Israel, and later on the Gentiles and the Israelites are reunited in the church under one, there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female. Maybe that's what it is. And I see that in there, and I see that's a possibility of a reflection or at least a hint towards that. So the Jews then would, years later under the new covenant, they would be joined together. That pretty well sums up chapter 10. Now look at chapter 11. Let's read the first 9 verses of chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had a brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they began to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore the name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. What were they told after, when Noah came off the ark? What was the first thing the Lord told them? Replenish the earth. You got to spread out. You got to be scattered, and you got to be spread out. They had one language, and probably they had a lot in common with one another, with one language. Now, were there times that they were against one another? Probably. They probably had divisions. They probably had fusses, you might say. But nonetheless, they had one language. They found a convenient place to camp, the plain of Shinar. It would hold all of those that were there then. I don't think they thought far enough ahead in regards to what was going to happen late years down the road when they kept multiplying, if that plain was big enough to hold them all. But they found a convenient place in which to build a city. They defied the instructions of God to spread and replenish the earth. You know, when you look at verse 4, when they said they built a tower whose tops is in the heavens, it's not like they were trying to reach heaven or reach where God was. It's just that they want to build this great big tower. There's speculation by some commentators that say they built this to avoid another flood, to get themselves protected from another flood, which again is a despising of the trust of God. They don't trust God and His Word and what God said to do. Maybe. But they did it to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be honored among men. The irony of that is they made a name for themselves. Not a good name, but they made a name for themselves. Again, protection from another flood. And then they did it to prevent dispersion. And they violated exactly what God told Noah to do in chapter 9, verse 1. So what we have here then is a bold, but as a side note, it's possible and thought probable that Nimrod was behind the building of this tower. He was a mighty man. He was one that aspired to be above all the others. He kind of ruled in that way. He had a kingdom that began in Babel. So it's a possibility and a probability that he's the one that drew up the plan, so to speak, to build this tower. So we have a bold opposition to God. You shall be scattered, God said. And they said, no, we don't want to be scattered. We don't want to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. We want to be right here. We want to protect ourselves, be together with one another. They say they're not going to do it. They defied God's instructions. Then we have a bold competition with God, I think. God is the universal monarch, Lord of lords, King of kings, yet they wanted all the glory and all the honor. They wanted to make a name for themselves. Again, that points to the characteristic or the personality of Nimrod in my mind when I read the things about what he says about Nimrod here in this short area. Verses 5 through 9, it says in verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Understand that the tower wasn't complete. They had gotten down the road a little bit. God saw what was going on, and he allowed them to progress to a certain point, and then he put a stop to what they were doing. The root of the problem lies in the fact that the people on the earth are but one, he says, and they are bound together to a strong unity by one language. God knew that could not but work harm to let this situation continue. Success can be accomplished with unity. Now, we're told in the New Testament that we need to be united together of one mind and one heart and one faith, one baptism, united. So you see an antithesis, so to speak, here. Their unity was causing issues. Our unity causes great things to happen. God knew that through mankind, that though mankind have one language, good could not come from the possession of it. And this was just merely the beginning of what they're going to try to do. And as long as they have this one language, that long will they be able to carry out reasonable things, though ungodly projects that they might devise in their own mind. God knew man. And he knew what man would ultimately do. He saw what happened from the creation. He saw what happened up to the time he destroyed all that he had ever made. And he supposed he wasn't going to do that again, but he knows what man's mind works, how it works. Yes, sir.
When I look at this story, I look at today, it's the same reason why we have denominations. You have them know what God said, build the earth and multiply. They didn't do it. They had knowledge. They took what they knew, but they put their spin on it. I got the impression also from reading about him that he wanted to keep everything under his control. So if they spread out, that would make him weaker.
Exactly.
So that's just speculation, but I gather that from what I read anyway. So when I think about the denomination board, which I came out of, and seeing what the scripture said, and then you have a man or a prominent person or a denomination that's multifaceted, and they say, well, we're going to do it this way. We're taking man's wisdom and throwing God's just
Right.
That's from that time on.
Exactly. So God discerns the similar undertakings will follow. So he puts a stop to it. This is the beginning of their doing, he says. And it means that more will be undertaken after the first enterprise. And nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them if we don't do something about this. If the only unity which they possess was one language, then he said we'll confuse that language, and that way they will be scattered. And so God confuses the language, scatters them, his will is accomplished. The earth is repopulated. Then we have, after that, the genealogy of Shem in more detail. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when we get to the questions. And then at the close of the chapter, we have Terah's descendants and the beginning of Abram, and the beginning of the Jewish nation. Okay, that's kind of a summary of all these. Now let's try to get through the questions in the last 20 minutes we've got to do. Notice the incident recorded in Genesis chapter 9, verse 18 through 29. What's the emphasis of that story recorded in chapter 9, the last part, 18 through 29? Pardon? The curse of Canaan. The father of Ham, Ham is the father of Canaan. I think there's a tip here, a tip of importance of this man Canaan is going to play in the history of the Jewish nation later on. So it is clearly an emphasis on the curse that Canaan had. From the perspective of the Israelites who were going to ultimately go into Egypt because of the famine and then multiply there and leave Egypt under the tutelage of Moses, bound for the land of milk and honey that God had promised Abraham that he was going to give his descendants. Their greatest threat were going to be the Canaanites, and they come from Canaan. And so I think we have a tip here in that about what's fixing to happen with later on, the importance of this man later on in the history of the Jewish nation. What task did God give Noah after the flood, and how is Genesis chapter 10 related to such? There's a rush question now, okay? Okay, so did Noah have other sons or daughters? Not that we are aware of. There's not any recorded, so we assume not. And so the nations of the earth would come from these three sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth. And the command that Noah would repopulate the earth would come exclusively through these three sons. And that's how chapter 10 relates to the instructions that God gave Noah in chapter 9 to go forth, be scattered, and repopulate the earth. What families are particularly emphasized in chapter 10 and why? I can't hear you. Shem. Actually, it's Ham and Shem, both. Again, we see this good versus evil. The question should have said, what families are particularly emphasized as it relates to Israel? Remember, that's what this study is about, how all this relates to Israel, because the story of the Bible is man is created, man sins and violates God's will. God then puts in place, or he had already had it in place, but God then says, I'm going to send a Messiah, I'm going to send a Savior, he's going to crush the head of Satan, his heel is going to be crushed in the process. He makes the promise to man that he's going to sweat by his brow when he tills the ground. A woman's going to have pain in childbirth, and Satan's going to be on his belly, and the Messiah is coming. And then God develops that, or Moses develops that up until the time that Abraham is brought into the picture in chapter 12. So the two descendants of Noah that seem to be underscored are Shem and Ham. The family of Ham are the sons Cush and Canaan. Most obvious reason for these points of emphasis is because Israel's primary enemies will come from Cush and Canaan, and also the Egyptians, Merizim, that's where the Egyptians came from. The Philistines came from Casluhim, the Canaanites, all those are descendants of Canaan and Ham. There's also mentioned Nimrod, which we've already talked about, who built cities of Babel and Nineveh. Those cities would be cities that would become enemies to Israel later on in Israel's history. Of course, Shem, the reason there's so much emphasis on Shem, and there's more emphasis in chapter 11 on Shem than in chapter 10, but the emphasis on Shem is because that's from where Abraham comes. That's where the Jewish nation arises. Israel, the children of Israel, come from his lineage. In Genesis chapter 10, verses 2 through 5, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshash, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashvad, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Jabin were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodom. From these, the coastland people of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his own language, according to their own families and to their nations. These are the descendants of Japheth. Where do his descendants factor into the Bible story in the future? They were Gentiles. Right. That's ultimately Japheth's descendants, the Gentiles. They would be made one with the Jews under the church and the new covenant. That's one thing. The other is the descendants also include the Medes, which is from Madai. Remember the Medo-Persian Empire? They had an effect on the Israelites. Javan, the Greeks come from the Javan. And Kittim, that's from which the Romans come, through Kittim. So they will represent enemies of Israel late in the Old Testament story and early in the New Testament story. These descendants of Japheth will have an effect, as well as being united with Israel, some of them because of the new covenant that Jesus came to establish. What's significant about Nimrod? And why is this description of Nimrod so familiar to us? Okay. Somebody over here said something. Mighty man, mighty hunter, chapter 6. Remember back in chapter 6, it talks about the giants that dwelled in the land. Mighty men of renown who were noted for their tyranny. So evidently Nimrod, as we've talked about already, was noted for his tyranny, noted for the fact that he wanted, as Dennis pointed out, if they scattered, he could not have control of them. So he wanted them under one roof, so to speak. And so everything really points to his design, him being the designer of the Tower of Babel. His kingdom, as we mentioned earlier, is the first that's mentioned in the Bible. Famous again for building cities that would be significant to God's people later on down in their history, especially Babel or Babylon and Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria when they go into Assyrian captivity. Both of these cities will be important not only as they will be capital cities of nations that will capture Israel, but also because Abraham. Where did Abraham settle before God sent him away? Ur of Chaldees. The Ur of Chaldees is really close to Babylon, or in the plain of Babylon. So it's really close to where that was. So it had an effect on all of the descendants of Noah. And it's also possible, as we said again, that Nimrod's connected to the story of the Babel, the Tower of Babel, a rebellion. God says, be scattered. Man says, no. God says, I am supreme. Man says, I want to be supreme. And that seemed to be Nimrod's attitude. And a lot of this came from, that I picked up, came from Meyer's Ancient History. So if you have a chance to do that, there's another one called Rawlinson's History of Old, I think, that you can pick up and you can see some of the things and historically how all this worked, as well as the writings of Josephus. In Genesis chapter 10, verses 13 through 19, Moses describes the descendants of Mizraim and Canaan. Why are these families of particular importance? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I read a commentary that said Israel was the forerunner of the Egyptian people in North Africa.
All right. Miriam was the forerunner of the Egyptian people. Canaan, of course, a forerunner of the Canaanites. Also, we have Calcium, he is a forerunner of the Philistines. You know, Israel is constantly in battle with the Philistines, particularly in the Judges. These descendants were principal threats to the children of Israel, particularly as they left Egypt and traveled toward the Promised Land. And they had to expel the Canaanites. You see how all this kind of meshes together, you know, and you see why God had them do the things they had to do, because the Canaanites had so far gone away from what God intended for man to be, and he wanted them destroyed. So that's the significance of those descendants of Canaan and Miriam. What about the descendants of Shem? If y'all don't talk a lot, we're going to run out. We're going to have some time left over, and I'm going to get in trouble. Huh? Edomites. Shem's descendants. Asher was a founder of the Assyrian Empire, ultimately. So Shem's descendants not only were good people, there were some bad lineage in that regard, because we have the Syrians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians come from some of the descendants of Shem. But the main importance of it all is the fact that Abraham descended from Shem. If you look at chapter 11, when we look at Shem's descendants, let's read that genealogy real quick. This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old. He begat Arphaxad. 2 years after the flood, he begat Arphaxad. Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Salah. Salah then, after he begat Salah, he lived 403 years and begat sons and daughters. Salah lived 30 years, begat Eber. After he begat Eber, Salah lived 403 years, begat sons and daughters. Eber lived 34, begat Peleg. After he begat Peleg, Eber lived 430 years. You notice a trend here? Their ages are going down. They're dying younger. And we don't think 400 years is very young, but their ages are descending. And you have Peleg, and that's going to be important in just a second. There's a question that involves Peleg in Russ's notes that we'll talk about in just a second. In fact, it's the next question. But you go and you follow that genealogy, and it ends with Terah, and then ultimately Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And so we have then the beginning of the Israelite nation. So that's the importance of the Shem genealogy, is the fact that Abraham came from it, but also the fact that there were enemies of Israel that developed from it. The Edomites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and so not only good folks, but bad folks. So you see good versus evil scattered through all this, all the time. Remember, after Abel was killed, Seth came, and Seth was the good, and Cain was still the evil. Yes, sir, Dennis?
I finished that with the fact that through Abraham came Jesus.
Right.
Also fulfilled with the prophecy that Moses was told when we get to chapter 12, 3 promises, and that made it possible.
Well, that's what the whole Bible story is about. That's reading these first 11 chapters we're going to talk about in just a second are important to the children of Israel. How it related is because God's promise was made back in the first part of Genesis, and then we see the fulfillment of that happening. And God, through Moses, had to pin all this down so we could follow what was happening. And now from chapter 12 on, we have the purpose of the Bible story, and that's the upcoming Messiah that was going to come and die for the sins of the whole world, and then the foundation of the church and the foundation of who we are today. So we're descendants of Noah, folks. That's kind of hard to put your mind around, but we are. Everybody in this world is. Now, this is the hard question, I'm sure, for everybody on this next one. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And in relative that to Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, about the Tower of Babel and what all happened there. What does this tell us about Genesis 11? First off, let me ask this question. In verse 25 of chapter 10, it says, in his days the earth was divided. What does that mean? Now remember, Moses is writing this, and he's here, and this all happened back here, so he's writing this. It's just the same thing as happened over in chapter 10, verse 5. It talks about everyone was separated, talking about the Gentiles according to their language. The first thing that hit my mind was I thought their language was all one. That's referring to something that happened in chapter 11. And what this is referring to in verse 25 is what happened in chapter 11 when God scattered them and divided the earth. He scattered them abroad, and so they were all scattered and the earth was divided. Now then, the mention of the earth being divided during the lifespan of Peleg kind of helps us to appreciate the time frame in which we can put Genesis chapter 11. If you take the genealogy that's mentioned in chapter 11, verses 10 and following, as describing consecutive generations, then Peleg is born around 100 years after the flood. And it says that he lived 209 years. After his kids were born. So that tells us that the Tower of Babel incident occurred somewhere between 100 and 300 or 400 years after the flood. Can't put an exact date on it, but it gives you an idea how far man had come after the flood, after God had destroyed everything. That had to be fresh in their mind. I mean, great-granddaddy told me about it, or great-great-granddaddy might have been, was probably alive. They live, I mean, I saw a chart, and it showed the overlapping of some of these people. And so they overlap one another, and these stories were passed down about what happened. I mean, can you not picture sitting around a campfire with Noah? And what he's talking about, and what he went through when he had to build the ark, and the criticism that he took, and how man was nasty to him. And he's telling his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren and his great-great-grandchildren about all that. So the flood happened, or the Tower of Babel, it seems it was somewhere between 100 and 300 or 400 years after the flood occurred. For what purposes did the people, question number 9, for what purposes did the people determine to build the city and the tower noted here, and why was this problematic? Go ahead and speak up.
You had said earlier possibly to avoid a flood again.
Yeah, avoid the flood, make a name for themselves, keep from being scattered. Why was it problematic? Violated God's commands. The earth wouldn't be populated. It wouldn't be replenished. And the intent of God was, I've destroyed every living thing on the face of the earth. I want it to be repopulated. I want it to be replenished. I want everything to be back in the place that it was. Yes, sir.
I think a lot of it too had to do with their focus was on themselves and what they could do to build themselves up, kind of like man today. You know, you see where as they begin to turn away from God, their focus becomes on themselves and how they can build themselves up, what they're capable of without God, and the lack of God. I think that's kind of where they were headed, and that's why it had to be stopped right
Exactly. We see that in Nimrod. We see that in the description we get of Nimrod. We see that very clearly, what you just said. And that is such the case. So they were in defiance of the command of God to scatter and populate the earth. Instead, the entire family of Noah migrated to the plain of Shinar. What was the practical outcome of God's confusing their language, and why was that important? They couldn't cooperate with one another. They couldn't get anything done. Can you imagine trying to build a house with some Vietnamese or some Chinese or some Spanish or some Polish people, or a different language than what we speak? Trying to build something, do something, it wouldn't work. Also, they would migrate it would be natural tendency for a human being to migrate towards those who speak the same language. So that migration would cause, it says God scattered them. I don't know if God said, okay, I want you to go to Spain, I want you to go to Greece. I don't know how God did that, but they would all migrate toward those who spoke the same language. Yes, sir. Right.
And, it's hard for us to imagine that, but, look at the history, like you said, the ones that went to the East Coast, they turned into the Romans and the Greeks. The ones that went to Egypt, we know what part they played.
Right.
The Israelites. And then the ones that were left in the fertile plain that God was planning all along to give to the chosen, that he develops. But, that's really how the world was divided at that point.
Exactly.
You see how it spreads from there. And, when you say 300 years from the flood, that doesn't sound that long. Just think how much the population of the U.S. is now versus just
200 years ago? Exactly.
200 something, 300 million, sort of some of that immigration. But to be honest with you, went from, a few hundred at the most to hundreds of millions of people in less than 300 years.
Right.
And then we're not all trying to have large families over a 300 or 400 year period.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking about this, that if you remember that Abraham was taking one man and prepared him to create a nation out of 70 people or so, and it was easy to deal with that, bring a nation in, and it would be to take this Nimrod, or whoever he was, and he was king over everybody. Think how long that would take to bring the Messiah in, because if you notice, all of the evil countries, he destroyed them completely because they were under the influence of idols, and he could see where they were not going to change. So if this was an evil country, which it seemed to be because they disobeyed God, they would all, let's take the China instance. Look at those people over there. They don't know God. They're a huge country. But God didn't intend for one person to rule the whole world because of the influence and the evilness that would permeate that whole world.
Right. Yeah. Huh? Can you what? Yes, ma'am. I did. Yes, sir. Right. Why is Shem's, question 11, why is Shem's genealogy given emphasis? We already mentioned that. We've already talked about the fact that it led us to Abraham, or Abram, and the birth of the children of Israel, the birth of the Jewish nation. Who recorded Genesis 1 through 11? Moses. Why are the events recorded included in other historical events omitted? That's those questions. It's a rush question or a rush answer. He gave me some notes, and the last page of his notes, that question was blank.
I think it's because other historical events didn't have a direct impact on the children of Israel the way these did. So, I mean, the Bible's going to be, as tall as this building, and there's every historical event that happened. We only get the stuff that's important.
Yeah, it's Israel's place in the scheme of redemption. That's what it is. I mean, the first 11 chapters shows us creation, the sin, the consequences of sin, the need for a Savior or a Messiah, and what happens in regards to God getting frustrated with children of the earth, people of the earth, and destroying them, and then repopulating it with Noah and his sons, and then all the people that came from that would ultimately lead to Israel, the birth of a nation, which would ultimately lead to the Messiah. And these events lead to the purpose of God, the scheme of redemption for all of mankind, through whom the Messiah would come, and to give us a view of how that all developed and what the mind of God determined all this before he ever created man. That's what blows my mind. That's what gets me. Looking at mankind and looking at what they were going to do, and God created them anyway. That shows you the great love that God had for us and the great love he has for all of mankind. And he'll go to the nth degree to save us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. He doesn't want us to lose our souls, folks. He wants us to come to repentance and to be what we're supposed to be. And he's merciful, and he'll forgive us over and over again. I don't know about you, but we all have our little sack of rocks we have to carry around. That's Mark's favorite saying, and that's true. And we return to it over and over again, and we get on our knees and we say, God, please forgive me of that. Why am I doing that? Why is that such an issue for me? But he's there, and he cares for us, and he'll love us, and he'll forgive us. And in the end, no matter what, Jesus will step in our place as long as we're faithful to him, as long as we're on our knees daily, nightly, and ask him to forgive us and to help us. And he'll be there for us. Thank you guys for your comments. And chapter 12 will be, let's see, it's Singing Wednesday, so it'll be next Sunday, chapter 12 next Sunday. Thank you, baby.